1,000 years ago, I did my residency here, really relied heavily. He's 2,000, yeah, I think he's 2,000 years old. And then went into private practice for a bit, went to the health plan as the head of OBGYN, and then directed the health plan. I was the director of the health plan. From there, I moved to the provost's office. If anybody ever wants to know the gory details, they're not that interesting, but went to the provost's office, and for the past 20 years, actually, I've been a deputy provost for health affairs, overseeing sort of the clinical medical parts of the university from the central university perspective. But also over time in the provost's office, there are no like firm barriers. You collect anything that doesn't have an attendant at the time. And I've gotten involved in a lot of academic integrity work for a while, human subjects protection, currently conflict of interest, scientific misconduct. But for the past 5 years, as a presidential appointee, not a provost appointee, I've been asked to be the university Title IX coordinator. And so the focus, I'm happy to talk about anything that you want to, but the focus today I thought we should take is that role that I have. I've learned a lot in that role. I want to share with you a little bit of technical information, some statistical information that's really just like the Barrett Values Survey has galvanized the medical school into action. We did an AAU survey with 26 other institutions on sexual misconduct that really has focused your schools and all schools and the college's attention on sexual misconduct at the university. But again, to the point that Peter was making, the real way to make change is to understand what we aspire to. We certainly want to know what all the don'ts are, and believe me, you'll know them by the end of this talk. But if we don't keep in mind the kind of culture we're aspiring to create, we just probably perpetuate the don'ts or have nonsensical responses to rules. And again, this is a gender lens, but it's, I'll show you why it's sort of an artificial barrier, the gender lens, not that gender isn't important. And I think you saw sexual harassment as one of the issues on the Barrett survey, top issues on the Barrett survey. So just a little bit of regulatory, what governs us, and why am I a Title IX coordinator? Title IX is pretty simple. It's about 37 words. It was created in 1972, and it basically says that any educational institution, preschool to geriatric, CME, is prohibited from discriminating based on gender or sex. I say gender or sex, and it's all genders, and certainly transgender is included in this definition. And the purpose of Title IX is to make sure that that we all have equivalent access to the benefits of an educational institution. The reason I like to start here is I think that's a good general. Most civil rights laws, most of the other titles are really geared toward making sure people have an equivalent opportunity to benefit from either the workplace or the educational environment. Now Title IX is sort of quirky because what was discovered through this case, the index case, if you will, was a woman at the University of Maryland who had finished a fellowship at a medical school she was in a basic science department, and she interviewed for 7 open positions in her department. Not interviewed, she applied, and she didn't get an interview. And when she went and asked, because she was quite accomplished in terms of what she'd done in her fellowship, when she was asked why she didn't get any interviews, the answer was, "You come on too strong for a woman." So that started a big firestorm, a lot of advocacy groups. And what they realized is that the Civil Rights Acts that were passed in 1964 applied to gender in the workplace, but excluded higher ed. And so it was, so the hospital, for instance, is subject to Title VII, which says basically exactly the same thing as Title IX, but it's with every lens, race, disability, veteran status. But somehow discrimination based on gender had been excluded in higher educational, or not higher ed, any educational institution. So that's why Title IX sort of stands alone. In many ways, it stands alone also because it arose in the middle of a very strong advocacy moment for women. But as I said before, it applies to all genders. We have Title IX discrimination cases that certainly where men are the complainants, where those individuals who don't identify across the gender binary our complainants. And just to bring it back to institutional goals, and I think these are also Dean Alpern's goals, really it maps directly onto our broader institutional commitment that we create the kind of environment that's civil, that's respectful, that's nurturing, that allows difference, that celebrates difference, that where everybody feels safe and they can thrive and pursue their academic and personal goals. So although we're going to look through a gender lens today, there's no lens of discrimination that's acceptable at this university, and artificially separating out some of these issues sometimes can make it difficult to think about our broader cultural aspirations. Now, Title IX is enforced by the Department of Education, the Office of Civil Rights. Who knows what's going to happen in the next administration? But it basically, if we hear of gender discrimination, and the interesting thing that I'm going to ask you to help me with later is if an institution knows or should have known, we are vulnerable to enforcement action. That should have known is really sort of interesting to think about. We're required to eliminate the gender discrimination, prevent its recurrence, address any broader environmental issues. If we hear of one incident, are there more incidents? And to the degree we can, repair the harms that have been experienced by the person. And I'm going to say complainant. That's what I use. We don't use victim language. We use complainant language. And we're required to have investigation and disciplinary procedures, resources to support those who've been impacted by gender discrimination or sexual misconduct, and prevention programs. So that's about the end of my technical regulatory tour, but in the booklets that I gave you, there's a whole appendix if you want to read in detail. The state of Connecticut also has laws that they've passed recently. I'll get into that in a moment. Now, we're going to talk, I just want to remind us that Title IX really applies to many, 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 many areas in an educational institution. And in fact, even though it started with gender discrimination in faculty hiring, actually the instant application was to equivalency in athletics. So many people, when they think Title IX, think athletics. I get a catalog of athletic apparel called the Title IX catalog. But it really applies to a whole host of things from admissions to discipline. The one area we're going to talk about today is what the government calls sex-based harassment. Now, we call it sexual misconduct, and we call harassment one version of sexual misconduct, just not to confuse the conversation. Now, why do we care about this at Yale? Well, one, we should care about it, but two, we have sort of a troubled history. About a decade ago, we were very prominently in the press for some very disturbing verbal activity from some of our student groups. The female population of the university accused the university of not responding and maintaining a hostile environment. So you can still see references to this in film. Anytime they talk about sexual misconduct, they often go back to these cases. And as a result of those very, very public cases, the community really galvanized. And again, there's some lessons here for what you're doing at the medical school. There were faculty committees, there were student committees that really looked at how we were responding to sexual misconduct in Yale. They culminated in a external committee that came and looked at all the work that these faculty and student committees had done that made recommendations to the president of the university, one of which was that they put all responsibility for Title IX in the provost's office. So that's my career opportunity, my career path. But basically said, we have a lot of mechanisms in place, but they're so fragmented and balkanized that it's hard for people to know where to go when they have a complaint of sexual misconduct. Interestingly enough, at the same time, almost on the same day, the government sent what they call a Dear Colleague letter to all institutions of higher education saying, we don't think you know that you're supposed to be addressing sexual misconduct pretty rigorously, and here's what we expect you to do. And at the same time, Yale got notice that it was under investigation by the Office of Civil Rights. So we were one of the first to go. There are now 250 institutions under investigation for violations of Title IX, particularly sexual misconduct violations, under the Office of Civil Rights. Our investigation closed without a finding of compliance or non-compliance. We entered into a voluntary resolution agreement that essentially we were poised to put in position a lot of programs already, and the government said, we're going to hold you to putting those programs in place. And I'll give you a little bit about that later. So that's one reason it's important at Yale. It was a very visible, painful issue a decade ago. One thing we started doing in 2011, 11-12, I got appointed in November of 11, as we started tracking complaints. We put in new complaint procedures, we made Title IX coordinators visible, we made our resources for support visible, and we committed to the community to be transparent about the kinds of things that came our way. And you may get an email from me if you've been around for a while. Every 6 months I send you an email saying my report's out. So every 6 months we provide not only statistical information, but also pages of descriptions of cases, of complaints that come to our attention of sexual misconduct. It could be assault, harassment, intimate partner violence, stalking, teacher-student consensual relations, policy violations. And we're really the only institution that does the descriptive. So we started doing that based on cases that came after July of 2011. So in the 5 years from July of 2011 until this past June, we've had 623 complaints of sexual misconduct brought to the university's attention, which is approximately 100 times more than the number that were brought in the previous 5 years. So great, we thought. Great, we're really pulling in the experience. Note that of these, the half are sexual harassment, and the others are divided between assault and the others are intimate partner violence, stalking, and violations of the teacher-student consensual relations policy. There have been both large volume of the complaints involving the undergraduate population, but increasingly it's involving graduate and professional students. There are faculty complainants and there are faculty respondents. You'll notice, particularly in the area of harassment. So we thought, great, these are all coming forward. Then we decided, well, this is a numerator. Let's find out what the denominator is. In addition, the government was pretty much pressuring everybody to figure that out. So we partnered with the AAU, which is our professional association for the presidents of the 62 research universities in the country, and we did a survey of sexual misconduct. This is what comes to our attention. We wondered what's out there that doesn't. And that was a sobering experience. This is online. We try to put anything online we can on our Title IX site if anybody wants to dig into it. We participated, all 62 institutions were offered the opportunity to take the survey. 27 decided that they would partner together with an outside survey firm to survey the prevalence of sexual misconduct on their campuses and also attitudes of their students. Now, this was only given to students, but for one of the first times it was given to undergraduate students, to graduate and professional students as well as undergraduates. There has not been that much good data out there about the prevalence of sexual misconduct. There's one study of 1,000 students in the Midwest that's quoted over and over and over again that quotes the 1 in 5 risk of rape in undergraduate women. So this was quite an undertaking, I must say, more than I thought. And I'm going to give you some of the results of that survey, but I first want to just swing through a couple definitions. The results of that survey really were sobering, as was the Barrett Values Survey. Our definition of sexual misconduct, I keep showing you this, everything's in the book, is basically any conduct of a sexual nature that's non-consensual. And the key word there is non-consensual. We actually have a definition of consent that's affirmative consent. So that means it's not a no means no, it's a you must have positive, voluntary, unambiguous agreement at every stage of a sexual encounter in order to have consent. It doesn't mean you have to have a checklist, and we do all kinds of workshops with our students on how to identify when you have consent. The state of Connecticut is one of 5 states that now has made affirmative consent the law for colleges and universities. So that's another reason I wanted to highlight it. These are the kinds of behaviors that are included. Now, the government calls everything sex-based harassment. We have sexual harassment as a very specific type of sexual misconduct. So I'm going to focus on harassment today largely because It is the behavior most commonly reported in the professional schools by our students. It's the behavior most commonly reported by faculty or about faculty. And so I thought that would be a good place to start. That said, I'd like you to be aware of some pretty worrisome statistics. This is probably not a surprising definition to you. You probably deal with assaults in your work. So the way to read this graph is that it is estimated that during the time they are, since entering Yale or during their time at Yale, 28% of undergraduate women experience touching or penetration by force or incapacitation. So those are the most mappable to rape and battery. There were also questions asked, did you experience penetration or sexual touching through the absence of affirmative consent, but not with force or incapacitation? That number goes up to 38%. So that was a wildly sobering number. That means 28% of our female undergraduates. The number for graduate and professional students is also unacceptable, but the undergraduate population was really a stunning number. We were not the highest number in the 26, but we were in the top tier. Another population, this was the first survey, I think, that really looked at the members of the population that don't identify on the gender binary. They are throughout this survey. And the survey looked at 4 behaviors: assault, harassment, stalking, intimate partner violence. I'm not going to talk about the other two, the last two too much, but in any of those behaviors, those who identified along the other gender spectrum were much, much more vulnerable than most of the rest of the population. So this was a sobering population. When asked who was the assailant, most commonly it was somebody the student knew, most commonly it was another student, most commonly it was a friend, happened most commonly in the residence halls, although the touching, there's more touching, certainly more touching than penetration, but still unacceptably high and sort of sobering numbers. But let's go to harassment. Because I want to really focus on that today, and you'll see the numbers for graduate and professional students are more equivalent to the undergraduates in this regard. I think of it, you may have your own definitions, I think of sexual harassment in sort of 2 buckets definitionally. The first is the quid pro quo. You have sex with me, I will, promote you, either implicitly or explicitly. I send the message that maybe you'll be on my paper, maybe I'll get you promoted, maybe I'll, something, that's the quid pro quo, and this is how our definition runs. Advances, requests for favors, or other verbal or physical conduct of a sexual nature when, and it can be explicit, implicit, but there's some understanding that if you do this for me, I will do this for you, and it often happens in power inequity situations. The other definition that we hear that most commonly comes into play with our complaints is the hostile environment definition. And again, the preamble is broad. You start with non-consensual sexual advances, requests for sexual favors, but then there's this other verbal or physical conduct of a sexual nature. When it has, and I want to underscore the purpose or the effect, it doesn't have to be intentional. It's through the eyes of the recipient, of unreasonably interfering with someone's academic performance or creating an intimidating or hostile environment. So those are the two definitional buckets. I imagine you don't have questions, but if anybody has a question about the definitions, okay. So let's look at how the AAU survey asked the questions. So this is how students intersected with sexual harassment in the survey. The questions were largely focused on the more hostile environment oriented behaviors. So, and what the question was, while you've been at Yale, have you ever experienced sexual remarks or jokes, inoffensive comments, or comments about your appearance? Had to engage in crude sexual conversation? Did somebody transmit offensive material to you? And then the last is more the continued advances despite a no. They were asked about each of those behaviors, but did you experience, not did you hear an offensive sexual remark, but did you hear it in a way that interfered with your academic performance? It's not that the remarks and the conduct in and of themselves aren't a problem, but really just to focus the results of the survey, you answered yes if that you experienced a behavior in a way that interfered. So now let's look at how we fared there. Oh, by the way, in terms of response rate, we overachieved. That's the good news on the survey. We had a 52% response rate. We offered it to all the graduate and professional students. Every school had a great response rate. We had a 52% overall response rate. In the AAU aggregate, the survey ended up being offered to 800,000 students. The AAU aggregate response rate was only 19%. So we really had one of the highest. Harvard had like a decimal point higher, of course. And also on the good news front, our students were very aware of the policies. 90% of them remembered being oriented to this material. If they sought out resources, they were comfortable with the resources. That's the good news. Now here's some more of the troubling news. So we also overachieved on our rates of sexual harassment. The gray box is the AAU aggregate. So the way to read this, let's just take graduate and professional women. And notice this starts at 30%. And I didn't create this graph. It was one of your basic science colleagues who did. And people always question why we start at 30%. But the way to read this is during their time at Yale, it's estimated, and these were extrapolated as estimates across the whole population, and they adjusted for response bias and a whole number of other potential biases. It's estimated that during their time at Yale, 54% of graduate and professional women will experience at least one of those 5 behaviors in a way that interfered with their academic performance. I mean, the undergraduates, enormous numbers. If you look at the undergraduates' harassment reports, they also say, you know, who harassed you? Again, their peers, their friend groups. That's where they were experiencing harassment. When you get to the graduate and professional students, there was more of a, there were more reports of harassment by faculty, by supervisors. The way to read this is it's not 16% of the 54. So here's that 53.8 again, and I'm just picking out the women to show you how to read the slide. It's estimated that during their time at Yale, 16% of graduate and professional women experience one of those 5 behaviors in a way that interferes with their academic performance from a faculty member. So that also was quite concerning. We did break this out. We met with all the deans of the professional schools. We went over, and they wanted school-specific data. Some of the schools were really small. We couldn't get the data, all the data. Westat and AAU weren't prepared to do it, but we got some school-specific data. And these aggregate data pretty much represent what happens in every professional school. Some schools had a little more harassment, some schools had a little less, but and some schools had more harassment by faculty. The dean shared with the students some of the school-specific data, and we can pull that out. But I think the deans all were sobered enough. I think they were all hoping that they were going to be the one that had no harassment in their schools, but nobody did. And the deans have been very, very active in working on prevention and response. The deans of the graduate and professional schools. The other question they asked is, if you experienced a behavior, did you report it to the university? So this is where we started. We had that 623 cases that we thought was great. Well, that's the tip of the iceberg. In some of the severe assault cases, reporting to a university official was at about 28%. I mean, highly unacceptable. You want everybody to be reporting those very severe penetration by force cases. In stalking and intimate partner violence, the reporting rates were higher. But I'm going to show you, for harassment, the question again is, if you experienced one of those behaviors, did you report it to any university program? There's really 3 to 6% the male and female graduate and professional students, if they experienced harassments, reported it to a university program. Now, I'm not sure they should all go to a university program. And indeed, they asked, if you didn't report to a university program, did you report it to somebody else? And one important thing for all of us to know is many of them report to trusted advisors, registrars, administrators in departments. So I think the lesson there is everybody should be equipped to deal with it. Yeah.
Certainly any gender can be sexually harassed, but I'm shocked at that 38% is men reporting sexual harassment. Is that consistent with
go back.
Groups or universities? Or? Anything about the survey
That's one that was, it was interesting. That is a high number. And again, when I'm doing this work, I've quickly come to realize, you know, gender is gender. It's not women, it's men, women, and transgender. It varied, the breakdown between men and women did vary a bit among schools. We have one school that shall remain, you know, I'm not, the deans didn't want to line up their data next to each other because one, it's not too useful, and two, they wanted to focus their schools on their own data. But there was one school where actually men reported more harassment than women. It was not the medical school. But in most of the schools, these numbers were roughly proportionate to that. So I will say, and I'm glad you asked that question, when we get complaints of harassment, I don't think we get this proportion of complainants who are men and women. I think we get more women than men. And so that is an issue for us to look at as well. Yeah.
Were there any differences based on those 5 questions you had? I think to me, there was a pretty big difference between like question 1 and question 5.
Yes.
So did it differ based on
Yeah,
that?
if you go back to the questions, and I don't think this should be at all reassuring, but this was the lowest. We were lower than the AAU on the transmission of offensive material, and this was fairly low. You know, I should have brought that slide where we broke it down by how many questions. Now people could answer more than one, so you could say I've had experience all. Each question you could say yes to, but the first 3 were the ones where the responses aggregated. So it was the remarks, the jokes. Engaging in crude sexual conversation. The transmission was pretty low, and the repeated advances was lower than the first 3. Yeah. Yeah.
Can I make a comment? So the reason why Stephanie's here, and I think this is important, is that I think you can look at these top 3, and believe it or not, so we know the medical school was one of the schools. The students in the medical school responded to this survey. Dean Alpern shared that with us, and disappointingly, it was relatively high for the medical students. And we also looked based on where it was occurring, and the surgical sciences, it was higher, okay? So we all have gone through training, we're all here. We've all been in the operating room. We know what happens in the operating room. We can see how this can happen. And where I think this is an important conversation or discussion is that we have to be far more sensitive of our environment. I think these things can happen. I don't believe, and I'll ask Stephanie to respond, that it's not malicious, but it's misunderstood. And it's something that we have to now be responsible for. And I think we were all shocked when we saw this data. And I think the world, it's good that we're now making ourselves aware of this. And so this increases our sensitivity and our responsibility. You know, we understand the operating room is a unique place, but I think also harassment, you know, that creating that hostile environment, I'm not sure it's beneficial. We all come from, you know, it's kind of an evolutionary training program, and we just have to get away from that. We also have to respect one another, regardless of gender, but also regardless of academic status, regardless of education. And I would hate to ask the same series of questions to the nursing staff in the operating room, okay? So this is why I think this is very relevant. I want all of us as urologists, I want us to be the best department out there. And I think the way to be that is to understand this and then act on this. So it's not as surprising. And that's why I think also seeing the male side of that, you can see where those can come from.
Thanks, that's great. Yeah, you know, I showed you that small, they don't report to university programs. I'll show you the university programs in a minute because I want to make sure you know them if somebody comes to you with a problem, what their options are. But we asked people, if you didn't report, why didn't you report? And the most commonly, the survey asked, the most commonly given reason was, I didn't think it was serious enough. And we thought, oh, well, okay, that's reassuring. But then we did some focus groups. And particularly on the harassment side, they said, well, we didn't report because this thing was said and nobody else said anything about it. And indeed, in studies that have been done, is that oftentimes people feel that their peers have a higher tolerance for this kind of thing than they do. because nobody's saying anything. And these are the kinds of behaviors that I think are very effectively dealt with on the ground, and I'm going to get into that in just a minute. But yes, and when we hear these kinds of complaints, when they actually come to our attention, as Peter said, often when I'll go talk to a respondent, that respondent is surprised and is eager to make a difference. And it's rare that you say, oh, I never did that and this is not a problem. But I think one of the biggest problems the students say is it looks like everybody else is tolerating this. And so the opportunities come in group settings where, and I'll get to that in a second, where we might be able to address some of these lower level comments. Low level doesn't mean they can't cause great harm, but the day-to-day comments and activities that we can impact.
Is there any? Do we have any information about the people who are doing the harassing? Right? Is this such a high number of people that are affected by this? Is it a small number of people who are impacting a large group of people, or is it a large group of faculty or other? You know what I mean? Is it a few bad apples, or is it the whole bunch?
Yeah, I mean, I would say with those rates, when you get a rate of harassment of like 55%, which we have, that's a cultural issue. So I don't think. Yeah, go ahead.
And so the other possibility with the rate that high is that we're casting such a wide net that the questions are so sensitive that we may be getting false positives. And is that possible that's why people aren't reporting? You said some of it is they said they didn't think the problem was serious enough. You know, that happens with us in our field. You know, well, people will come in and they'll have, you know, urinary symptoms, right? And so we assess their urinary symptoms, and there's also like a bother score. If they're not bothered by it, then they don't get treated.
Yeah.
And you know, sometimes is it possible that in our vigor to make sure that we're stomping out this very real problem, that we're casting too wide of a net?
I think so. There's sort of a couple parts to that I want to answer. So first of all, in terms of bother score, that's why you only answered yes if it had this impact on you. And they also, when they said it was not serious enough to report, it was generally a read on how the community rated seriousness. They also asked the question, did you experience an untoward impact? The rate was high, at least in this survey. Do we cast too broad a net? One thing I do worry about is if we're saying that every single inappropriate remark should go all the way through a formal disciplinary process, I would say that's too broad a net. And I also think in a community like this, we have to talk about speech, what's acceptable, what's not acceptable, and that we're not out to chill free speech. On the other hand, if somebody's speech is actually inhibiting somebody else's ability to speak or to participate, then that's no longer in our definition of free speech. I think we have a more aware community that and that may be a good thing, that we should be working on these kinds of behaviors, not so much to discipline, but to work together on what we aspire to. In the harassment side, assault, no. But I mean, on a lot of these harassing behaviors, and that's actually what this. I'm gonna jump ahead, even though I want you to know what the resources were. Over the last year, we've done something like 150 presentations of the AAU data in various forms. Every dean decided they wanted to have town halls. In FAS, the dean of the FAS said every department had to have a town hall. And what would happen is people look at the data and go, what do we do? And actually led by a group, and that is a question. The prevention literature is not very good on sexual misconduct. But there is some success with something called bystander intervention at the assault and undergraduate level. We've been training our students for years on how to intervene when somebody looks in a risky situation at a party, how to say, you know, let's go get a pizza, or, you know, and they have a whole group of communication and consent educators, they call them. I'll show you their picture because they're very festive to look at. This one. This group, and they are intensively trained and embedded in all of it, sports teams, fraternities, whatever, to work on prevention and intervention efforts. And so after the graduate and professional community and the deans saw this data, a number of things have happened. And I'm going to come back to bystander in a minute. Some of them decided to make it real, because looking at the data, oh my goodness, and you ask these questions, one thing is, can we know more from the data, which we've tried to do. We've had study halls with faculty who are interested. We've tried to learn more, but in terms of action, so drama, I put the drama emblem up there, decided, okay, what we'd like to do to make this real for our community, to go beyond a town hall with the data and all, beating our chests, they decided they would do something that related to what they did professionally. So they decided to create a protocol for scenes in their plays that are sexually explicit or have sexual violence. And they worked with their community to create this protocol for scenes with they have fight coordinators for fights. Now they have a I don't want to say sex coordinator, but they have rules for when you can say no to touching in a scene, how many people should be in the room for rehearsal. And it's not so much as the protocol, which is interesting, it's a good protocol, but it got their community involved in a way that interacted with what they did. Forestry, likely, this is forestry, their complaints, the place they're really vulnerable, and some other places are in field work, where boundaries get a little blurred because people are traveling together and spending 24 hours together, and we get some complaints there. So they created a guide for field work that would, what can you expect in terms of a safe environment. Some departments have created climate committees or committees to look at, and what happened with the AAU survey is it came out, and immediately after that came out, all the uproar on campus about racial discrimination also happened. And we're working, the issues are related, the behaviors are related, so oftentimes these committees have become broader climate committees like Peter's been talking about. Most importantly, everybody wanted to know how to continue the conversation, but having lectures from me is not necessarily a way to continue a conversation. So a group of the professional students worked with us and worked with the undergraduates who've been doing this for years to create these scenarios, which are not, and created what they call a bystander intervention workshop. And the medical students recently did this as they transitioned to the wards. They actually had us conduct a workshop for them where they created their own scenarios so that you can discuss where the pain points are, you can discuss where the power differentials are, you can discuss how you would intervene if a comment was made. You have to find ways to intervene respectfully to counter disrespectful or hurtful communications. And so we've piloted, and many of the professional schools have piloted a version of this graduate and professional bystander intervention. And so what I provided you with are some of the scenarios we've used, but the workshop is much more extensive. So if anybody's interested in that, we've been doing that where we're looking for a faculty group to do a faculty version of bystander intervention. But there is a real appetite now for more conversation from the students and from the residents. I want to say a word about residents. We've also worked with the hospital. So the hospital is subject to Title VII. It's not considered an educational institution. It has a different set of disciplinary rules, but the same goals. So we've been working with the hospital. Rosemary Fisher is one of our Title IX coordinators and has been a good interface with the hospital. So we will receive complaints from residents. We will receive complaints from nurses at the hospital as long as it involves somebody in our community. I want to say two words about what the actual resources are. So after 2011, where we were told we had every school, every flower was blooming in terms of disciplinary processes, I wanted to say a little bit about what we try to consolidate our resources. One outcome of all the turmoil was sexual misconduct is really a different kind of behavior. You can't review it like you do plagiarism or other kinds of academic problems that students, faculty have. So the university and the deans all agreed that they would sort of cede their disciplinary committee authority to one committee, the university-wide committee, chaired by a tenured faculty member, currently David Post of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology. One committee that would hear all cases of sexual misconduct that involves students, faculty, and non-unionized staff. And that committee has heard of those 623 cases, about 80 5 have gone through that committee. That's the one place someone can go if a complainant really wants a formal disciplinary process for the respondent, or if we think that the situation is so dangerous that we occasionally can bring a complaint on behalf of a complainant because we think that the situation is risky to the university. So that's a committee that hears cases. They have outside fact finders. They have a whole process. It's online. But most people don't, and we always go, our first and foremost, we want to support the person who has the complaint. They've lost control once. They may have suffered a number of harms. So the first thing is support the person, make sure they feel safe, make sure they can continue to function, or if they need a break, or if they need an extension, or they need a new residential accommodation, we do that. So most people go to a Title IX coordinator, most of those complaints, and the Title IX coordinator, one, tells them about all the other options, but also is there to make sure that they get the support and resources that they need to function in this environment. So there's a coordinator for each school. Medicine has 2, Merle Waxman and Rosemary Fisher. We're always looking for other people who are interested. Carl Hashimoto is the graduate School of Arts and Sciences coordinator. Unfortunately, he's leaving at the end of February. The police department has a special sensitive crimes unit that they're very wonderful to work with. And then when in doubt, we send people to the Share Center. The Share Center is a sexual harassment and assault resource and education center. It's staffed by licensed psychologists. It's the one place that's sort of protected from having to share information with anybody else. And they're 24/7. They carry telephones. And most people think they're just a rape crisis center, which indeed they are, but they'll talk about relationship problems and they'll deal with harassment cases. So often, at least students like starting there because they know that they can talk it out and nothing will go anywhere. A myth I want to address is if they go to any of these other bodies, those bodies are confidential. It's just that everybody, including all of you as faculty members, who hear of a complaint of sexual misconduct are required to at least report it to me because we're supposed to keep track of everything that happens. So there is a mandatory reporting rule, and it applies even to students when they're in the TA capacity. That does not mean if I get a complaint that I'm going to instantly march off and pursue a formal process. We don't do anything the complainant doesn't want unless there's a big safety risk, as I said. So some people have equated Share being confidential and everything else being not confidential. But if someone if you talk over a complaint with me, I won't go to your chair. I won't go to the complainant's chair. We just talk out first and foremost, how to support the complainant. But I do want to make sure you know you do have to report. The police have to report to me. The university-wide committee has to report to me. And that is that if we knew or should have known about something, we're required to take action. I have talked very fast. And we're almost, I want to leave a little time for some more questions. I think what I'd love to hear from you as you work with Peter on this broader issue is what you identify in your own community as the best means to generate more conversation. We're not here to impose rules on what a good word is or a bad word is or a good action is or about in terms of those top 3 behaviors. It's really the community that decides what it wants to be and what it finds to be admirable behavior and behavior to aspire to. And I've seen some departments do it beautifully, having conversations with their faculty and staff. Other departments aren't used to having this kind of most of them aren't used to having this kind of conversation among an open place where you can say, gee, that didn't really feel good, or let's play this out. That's why we did the scenario, so you don't have to talk about your own behaviors, you can talk about hypotheticals. The scenarios I left are all based on actual complaints. Many of our complaints are much more severe than this, but these are the kinds of things to start with as a community to build some sort of conversation. And I'm going to let you ask questions rather than go on. I have, yeah. Did you have your hand up?
I have a question about, it's kind of a definition question here, about capacity. And I'm assuming we're talking about self-imposed incapacity where people are being drunk, not they're being forcibly incapacitated given some drug by not their choice.
Could be either.
I don't know, it could be either, but I'm just,
It could be
but
either.
percentage-wise, which is the more common.
Much more common than incapacity itself.
Okay, so we're talking about self-imposed incapacity, and not to be facetious, I think when I look back at some of my colleagues' college days, not myself, I was studying through most of college, that when you have this self-imposed incapacity, that's the goal for a lot of folks. And I think it's, although as we have a different perspective now as we're older, we say we're going to try to change that amongst our younger community, that we don't want them to have self-imposed incapacity after too much. But how is that being addressed? Because the denominator, I guess, also is how many people are being incapacitated versus how many people are having this assault, and how do you change that behavior, which is something that they clearly really want.
So with the undergraduates, a lot of the assaults are associated with some sort of substance use, whether they were incapacitated or not. Another myth is one drink does not incapacitate a person. What we've been doing, and another myth is it's always alcohol and sexual misconduct. So we have an assistant dean in Yale College who's also been working with us with graduate professional students and faculty. He's a scholar and there's the research in both the alcohol, culture change, and sexual violence literature. And has really been working, what we've been trying to do is although we understand there's a correlation between alcohol and sexual misconduct, really deal with the behaviors separately rather than assume one leads to the other. So that's one. Two, the focus that we're taking with undergraduates is you know when you're getting consent, and you know when the person you're with can give you consent. And so we're not focusing so much on what the person who got incapacitated wanted or intended at the beginning, but whether the person they're with, who may also be under the influence, knows that he or she has, or they have gotten consent.
Can I pull back on that? Do you think that's always true? I mean, if you have two individuals that are both incapacitated, potentially incapacitated, do they really know when a person's giving consent? Do you think it's that black and white?
Well, it may or may not be. I mean, Melanie gives a wonderful talk on consent that's taught me a lot about what we know and what we don't. And certainly with alcohol, you get myopic, meaning you focus on near-term, not long-term goals. So, but you don't basically, what she will tell you, the literature says you don't basically change your whole nature when you're inebriated, but you may make decisions in a more myopic way. But what she would say, if you don't think you have consent, if you don't know, you don't have consent. That's the way they're training the students. They're training them what healthy consent looks like, healthy relationships. And many people may go through totally inebriated, incapacitated sexual encounters and never bring a complaint.
I'm sure a lot of them.
Yeah, but
I mean, the reason I asked, I just think it's such a hard position because I think we've become appropriately sensitive to this now because a lot of bad things have happened and people are being assaulted. But I think if you really had to ask people to be sincere and you said, why are you becoming incapacitated? The answer is not going to be, well, I want to feel really shitty tomorrow and I want to throw up tonight. It's really that they're going to some goal for being incapacitated for a certain reason, and I could give you my thoughts of why I was being incapacitated in college. So, or my friends. So I just think there's some reality to it. And again, not to question it, I just think it's a very hard situation because my mentality now versus when I was a young college student is just very different. And I think it's interesting because now we have these peers, which I think are important, that are supposed to go into the parties. They pull your friends out and say, hey, you're incapacitated. Don't go home with that man or woman. Come home now. You're too drunk to do something. And at some percentage of time, the person will say, thank you, you saved me. And another high percentage of time is, get the hell away from me. I'm incapacitated on purpose. That's why I'm here tonight.
They might no, they won't pull them away. And they're not incapacitated. They're not alcohol police, these students. They're trying, many times what they are doing is they often are friends of people who know that they didn't want to do this at the end of the evening, and they see somebody who's getting a little unable to control themselves, and they may or may not be incapacitated. They may just look uncomfortable. They may look like they're trying to get away from somebody that's afraid to get away from somebody and they impede. So I don't want to make it too, I'm with you, don't make it too black and white. And again, we don't, there may be people who go out for an evening and they want to have alcohol in order to make it more likely that they'll lower their inhibitions and do something.
At least some small
Yeah.
percentage of folks.
But so that's why we focus more on when you're in the encounter, here's how you know if you have consent. If you don't know you have consent, there's a risk there. It doesn't mean don't do what you want to do, but here's what consent looks like and here's what it doesn't look
All right, I have no more.
like.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just gonna say that does seem a little confusing though, to say that people know when they have consent, because, the question is, let's say someone does not appear to be physically incapacitated, but they've been drinking enough to be intoxicated, right? And they provide the verbal consent, the affirmative statement, yes, this is what they wanted. But how can a person who's intoxicated provide consent?
This is a whole lecture that I think we have it on, even online, if you want to look at it, Melanie talking about that. It's a very tricky thing, and when the UWC gets these cases where there's alcohol involved, it's tricky. Incapacitation is, it's almost a definition that requires another definition. It's that you're unable to make a considered judgment about behavior. So intoxicated people do know what their values are. They do know what they want. They don't lose sight of that. But again, we're not focusing on whether the person giving consent knows they're giving consent. It's whether the person receiving the consent knows. And if it's ambiguous, you're in a risky zone of maybe later the person is going to say, I didn't mean that. If you're not getting, what Melanie would say is that they're clear signals. They don't have to be verbal. They don't have to be written, consent. I can't tell you the number of people trying to sell me apps, consent apps, where people can, click off consent. But that they're clear signals. If you have them, great. If you don't have them, it doesn't mean it means you have them somewhere else.
I just want to
wait.
because it's 8:30,
Yeah,
and I just want to conclude by, let's bring this back to our environment. And I think we all have to agree that urology is a very vulnerable area within the hospital. Because of what we do every day, we're a bit desensitized. And because of that, we may not be as sensitive to what we're saying and doing. And I think we have to put that more in our forefront and think about that moving forward. That's the purpose of this. And realize that it's not just sexual harassment to our peers and to the staff, but also to our patients. And I had a transgender patient, actually Pat operated on him, and was seeing another physician in the area, came in because felt very much sexually harassed by the physician during their interview. When asked about those questions, it's, you could say, yes, definitely this was inappropriate, but it was right on the line. And for that person to be operated on in Yale New Haven Hospital, we had to go through sensitivity training for the OR staff, for the nurses taking care of that patient afterwards. So we impact, our sphere of influence is huge. And I think because of our specialty, we are dealing with very sensitive topics, and we just have to become very cognizant of our actions and our words. And Stephanie, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
All right,
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.